This episode is brought to you by the Command Presence Leadership Institute. Find out more by visiting commandpresence.net.
Welcome to the Faces of Leadership with Michael Warren. Be the leader you wish that you had.
Welcome to the Faces of Leadership podcast, where we believe that leadership is about two things. It's about people and it's about actions. Here on the podcast, we talk with leaders from across society who are stepping up to do what they can, where they are with what they have. The question is, what can we learn from them? What can we learn from each other as we strive to be the leader that we wish we had? Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Warren, and I'm your host. Thank you for being with us today. And folks, if you've listened to any of the episodes before, you know what I'm about to say next. I'm really excited about the episode today. Our guest today, folks, he's not only a colleague, he's my brother. Not in the biological sense, but he's my brother because he's a man that I love, I admire, and I try to model myself after. I have learned so much from him, and I continue to learn how I can be a better man, a better husband, a better father, and a better professional from the example that he sets. So let me go ahead and give you just a brief rundown. And folks, listen, I had to abbreviate this because this guy has done a ton of things. This won't nearly cover it all. But our guest today is the Criminal Justice Department Chair from Madonna University in Michigan. Prior to joining Madonna, he served as an assistant chief of police with the city of Novi here in Michigan. During his 28-year law enforcement career, he served in a variety of positions. He worked as a patrol officer. He did undercover narcotics. He was a canine handler, and he was a detective, as well as numerous supervisory positions. He's a graduate of the FBI NA, a highly sought after appointment for people in the executive ranks. His work as a police officer has been recognized by the International Narcotic Enforcement Officers Association, the National Retail Federation, and the Michigan Association of Private Investigators. Folks, he's so good at what he does. National Geographic Channel actually profiled one of his cases in their documentary film, The Science of Interrogation. Welcome to the podcast, my friend, Victor Lauria. Vic, welcome.
Thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here today.
But buddy, you know, when you sit there and you listen to someone do an intro of you, the longer it goes on, that means you've lived a long time, and the older it makes me feel. Do you get that same sense?
Yeah, especially when I look back at my career. It seems like yesterday I was actually in the profession doing the work, and now that it's been a few years since I've retired, I always kind of look back and go, wow, am I still relevant today? You know, I remember what it was like, but as you and I both know, we work hard to stay up to speed and be relevant at the current trends.
And so I want to start with, instead of starting at the beginning of your career, I want to start with a career where it's at right now, because I think that staying relevant is something that people in higher education like yourself oftentimes neglect to do. And I know that you work really hard at it as the person charged with running the Criminal Justice Department with Madonna. How do you try to keep the program relevant for the people that are coming in as students pursuing a career in criminal justice?
Well, I'm constantly reviewing the program and the course offerings and the instructors that we have at the university to make sure that they are up with the current trends and have the latest knowledge. You know, a lot of times what happens with people, and I guess I'm an example of that, is I retired a few years ago, and you have a wealth of knowledge of what's going on in the profession at that time. But over the course of 5, 8, 10 years, a lot of things change. And if you're not staying current, you're not reading the current research, you're not interacting with colleagues and seeing what best practices are now, you can fall behind. And in one of my complaints when I was in college, way back in the 80s, which seems like, 2.5 lifetimes ago, a lot of my professors were teaching police work from the early 70s, and it wasn't really relevant. And when you look at today and the pace of change today, simple things like technology. When I left the profession, we did some cell phone dumps, but the most information we got out of a cell phone dump is when was the last call made? When was the last call received? How long did it last? And the general direction off the cell phone tower that the signal was received. And over the course of the past, 10 years, now we can nail it down to within a few feet of where that phone call was. It's constant work to stay up to speed so that you are fully preparing your students to go out into this career with the latest knowledge.
Would it be a correct characterization that you're trying to prepare your students for the profession that exists now, not the one that existed when you were in the profession?
And not only that, what exists now, but what's coming in the future. Here are the changes that you can anticipate. And oftentimes when we look at changes, we focus in on technology. DNA in its infancy was, you had to have blood or some tissue. And now there's touch DNA, and you can get DNA off of hair without a root. So those kind of things are important, but also the cultural changes that are going on. Because obviously a lot has changed in our field over the past 6 to 8 years.
You also do some work as a trainer.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know what your experience is, but at least my experience has been that if you've got a student that's just coming into the profession, that their ignorance of the technology, for example, it's understandable because they're not in the profession. Where I think becomes incredibly problematic for us are people who are still active in the field that are ignorant of the technology. And it's important to point out, folks, that Vic is not only, he tries to keep abreast of the technology, but one of the things that changes often in this profession is case law.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's equally important, if not more important, to stay abreast of the case law. And so many people, and I don't want to, maybe so many people is not the right. There are a number of people in the profession that fail to stay abreast of any changes going on whatsoever in the profession.
That's one of the problems with our profession is once we get to an acceptable level and we don't encounter routine problems and have questions, you think about the new officer that comes into the field. The first few years on the job, they're full of 1,000 questions. Hey, boss, can I do this? What about this? I'm not sure what to do here. And once they get comfortable with those answers, a lot of people fail to progress. They become comfortable. What I challenge not only my students, but the active duty law enforcement officers that I train is to look to the future. What is the next thing coming? Reflect on your own self and where do you come up short? Where are you weak at? What areas do you need to study more? Do you need more training in so that you can not only stay current, but be one of the leaders in the field? And I was very blessed in my career that I had what I call a lot of high speed, low drag people that I looked at that I was always amazed at their expertise in various fields. And when I saw that, I said, I want to be like them. I want people to come to me and ask me for advice because they trust me and they know that I have the knowledge to point them in the right direction.
And just so our listeners have an idea of how technology has changed, Vic and I worked numerous cases together during our career. There was an interview that we wanted a transcript of. Oh. And so Vic, if you can kind of describe for our listeners what doing a transcript looked like, quote unquote, back in the day.
We had, but actually we were on the cutting edge of audio and video recording interviews and interrogations. It wasn't even common back then. And we installed a system in our interview room and started recording interviews, which was great. The issue became when we had significant cases, the prosecutor wanted a transcript. And literally what we would do is we would pop the VHS tape into the recorder, play a few seconds of it, pause it, type it in, play a few more seconds, type another sentence or two in there. And then we'd have to go back and we'd say, what word are they saying here or there? It would take days and days to do several hours of a transcript. And now, today, all you do is you pop it in a program and it spits it out and it's 95% accurate and it happens in seconds.
And it's a much better job than what you or I did because, folks, if you've never seen one of those old transcripts that were typed, if you got to the point where you just couldn't frickin' figure it out, you would just put in quote unintelligible. Yeah. There were a lot of unintelligibles when you and I were going through and doing the typing.
There were. That's an example of how things have advanced. The tools and technology that current professionals have available to them are much broader than what we have. But tools and technology only help the person if they understand how to use them. And, my goal is not only an educator in higher education, but also training active duty law enforcement officers is to provide people with more tools and more knowledge how to use those tools. I frequently tell people or ask them, if I gave you lumber, nails, a saw and a hammer, could you build me a shed? And they can build me a shed. But if I gave you those same tools with a measuring tape, a level, a compound miter saw, a carpenter's square, and I taught you how to use each one of those tools, could you build me a better shed? And obviously the answer is yes. So it's not only providing tools, but providing the education and the know-how behind them to give them the ability to make a better product.
So would you agree with me, even though we haven't used the word leadership yet, that's one of the basic things, perhaps the most important thing that a leader is supposed to do is to provide the tools, the best tools available, and the training on how to use them. But the leadership really kicks in when we talk about when and how best to use them.
I think that is really the essence of leadership. It's what I call technical and tactical competence. And when I say tactical, I don't necessarily mean in a SRT type situation or use of force, but I mean, do you know when to be able to do that? I think that's really important to provide people with the knowledge of here's what to do and here's when to do it.
It has been my experience, and yours may be different, but when we're doing that type of thing as a leader, the message is oftentimes better delivered when I can tie that learning to something that really happened in my life, where I can take this concept and I can take it from the abstract world and I can put it in the world of concrete. To be very transparent, it works best when I can take a story of when I screwed something up, when I used the tool inappropriately or at the wrong time or with the wrong emphasis. It seems that the learning is longer and stronger if the leader is willing to be transparent and vulnerable in that type of way.
That's a really difficult thing for leaders to do, is to be vulnerable and admit when they've made mistakes. I constantly use stories, whether I'm teaching at the university or I'm out teaching with command presence and delivering classes to active duty law enforcement. A lot of law enforcement officers love to tell stories, and that's great. But what is the point of the story? And when I talk to people in an educational atmosphere, there is a point to my story. A lot of people don't like to admit when they come up short, when they've made mistakes. But I found that, especially if you're in a leadership capacity, when you show your vulnerability and say, hey, you know what? Here's some mistakes I made along the way, and here's what I learned from them, and here's why you shouldn't make the same mistakes. students and law enforcement officers really understand the concepts behind that.
Well, as you and I progressed during our career, being able to hide mistakes got harder and harder. When you first started, hardly any recordings,
None.
people didn't pay attention. Now when it seems when you screw something up, there's a gallery of people that are there, and they're all recording, and they've got a 360 degree angle because they're gathered around you. So it's almost becoming that denying a mistake, it's even more useless than it was before. And it denies you the opportunity as a leader to turning it into something useful.
I always believed that admitting your mistakes or your errors, because, some of the time we have the best of intentions and we do the wrong thing and it doesn't turn out right. There are other times where we make conscious bad choices. We know we're going to do something that we shouldn't do and we hope to get away with it. But admitting your mistakes, either one of those, whatever they are, is really the best course of action. At the university level, I have a fair share of students who come to me with some issue or problem, whether it's regarding an assignment or an exam. There's always the excuse. Hey, I need extra time, or I'd like to redo this because A, B, C, D. And in most of the time, what I find out is it's poor planning or procrastination. And when I talk to them about what's the real reason behind this. And most of the time, eventually they'll admit, hey, you know what? I put it off till Friday and then I got busy and the Wi-Fi crashed, whatever. And I explain to them the importance of doing that in the real world. Because at the end of the day, whether you're an employee, a middle manager, or an upper level administrator, your word, your level of trust is critically important.
I think that leaders intuitively know that there's a possibility that something could go wrong.
Sure.
I mean, that's the reason why on so many of these high risk events, we have redundancy of systems, that you've got a backup computer, you've got all those things, because it may not be likely that there's going to be a failure, but there's a probability of it.
Sure.
And that mere recognition of it from a leadership perspective, what I'm looking for is for someone to admit that there was a failure and they're looking to rectify it instead of trying to lay out this tale of woe. But you know what, though? I think leaders have to celebrate, for lack of a better term, when people step up and take the ownership of a failure like that.
I know especially when I was a boss and I had to give out various disciplines for errors, mistakes. When somebody came forward and said, you know what, I really screwed this up. Here's what happened. I'm sorry about it. That's the individual that's much more likely to be cut a break by me than somebody who comes in and says, I don't know what happened, or tries to blame somebody else or some other thing for their error. But, one of the things that I want to make clear here when we talk about leadership is a lot of people have a misconception about leadership. When we talk about leadership, we often picture a boss, the head of an organization, an assistant chief of police, the department chair. But leadership starts with individual leadership. And I think that's critically important. That's one of the things that I like to pass on to my students. When we say the word leader or leadership, we don't look up the organizational chart. The first thing we have to do is look inside of ourselves. How am I leading myself? What behaviors and actions am I doing that show not only myself, but other people that I'm a leader?
It's interesting that you brought that up because in an institution of higher learning, almost every university now has in-person classes and they have online learning, right?
Correct.
Would you agree with my assessment that it takes a certain degree of individual leadership to be successful in online learning? because it's work intensive. Yeah, you're not having to go and sit in a class at a particular time, but it requires an amount of self-discipline where you're getting your assignments. And I hate to use this word, but there's really no other word to describe. It's a grind. It's a grind. You're churning out work, showing that you know the material. And if you don't have that individual leadership, you're probably not going to be successful in that type of learning.
Oh, definitely in my experience, I've come across numerous students that the online environment is very difficult for them. And other students come to that realization very early on that they don't like online classes. They prefer an in-class experience where there's regular interaction between the instructor and the student, and they can ask questions and get clarification on things very easily.
And that brings us to another part of this thing that I've been wanting to discuss with you. You retired as an assistant chief, where you had formal authority over just about everybody in the organization that didn't have chief in their title.
No.
And then you go over to this academic environment where you have a responsibility for a large group of people. But the truth be told, your formal authority is limited. I mean, the class that have to be taken, you've got a little bit of leeway, but it's prescribed in the course catalog, right?
That's correct.
You've got a certain amount of GPA that must be maintained in order to get credit for a class. You've got all of these things that are laid out sometimes by the university, sometimes by the accrediting body. So your leadership role, it has a management aspect to it, but when it comes to the people enrolled in the program, it is true leadership where you're trying to influence the decisions that they make. And I think a perfect example is just the one that you just talked about. That person that is struggling in an online environment, how do you try to show them? How would you describe the way that you try to show them that maybe there's a different way that may work better for them?
You're really correct when you say, there's not formal leadership or formal authority that goes along with my position. But what I use when I get with students is influence. And I think influence is one of the foundational blocks of leadership. But before you can influence somebody, you have to have a relationship with them. So I try very hard to build relationships with my students. I probably have 135 or 145 majors in my program, so that can be very difficult to juggle. But if I have a student who is struggling in a class, the first thing I do is work to identify what the potential problem is and then work on a relationship with them. In my previous career, it was pretty easy to call somebody in who was having an issue or a problem and say, hey, don't do this, or the policy says this, or if you do this in the future, here's what's going to happen. That's not really leadership. That's more authority. With my students, that doesn't work. I bring them in, I talk to them, I ask them about any challenges that they're having, why they may have come up short on the quality of an assignment or an exam. And then through my relationship with them, I give them my best advice. I don't think that in the future you should take this class online because here's what the issues are. Now, ultimately, at the end of the day, even though I may refer to my students as kids throughout this, they're really not kids. They're all 18 to, the average is 18 to 22 or 23 years old. So they're all adults. But what I try to do is influence them to make the best decisions possible.
So it's an interesting dynamic when you're dealing with people that people refer to it as their first taste of freedom. Mm-hmm. Freedom in that sense, it's their first chance to really be the decision maker in what goes on in their lives. Just because you have the authority to make the decision for your life doesn't necessarily mean that you have the experience or knowledge necessary to make the best decision. Would that be accurate?
Without a doubt.
So then would it be correct to classify what you're really doing, especially during the first year or two of somebody's academic career, is a lot of mentoring? Because you have experience not only in the profession that they're aspiring to, but you also have that academic experience where you've had students that you've seen that have tried something and it didn't necessarily work. So you're really trying to serve as a mentor. And I think it's interesting that when you have those conversations, how often you include, hey, I don't think this is the best thing for you, and here's why. You include the why behind it.
Not only the why behind it, but I always end it with, at the end of the day, you're an adult. You're going to make your own choices. Whatever choices you make, you're going to experience the consequences of that, positive or negative. In my program, starting out as freshmen, I meet with every single student. So throughout their academic career, when it comes to scheduling classes and advising appointments, I meet with them at least once a semester, if not once a year. The benefit to that is, number one, I develop a relationship with them. I can review their academic progress, and I can start to influence them or mentor them and provide them guidance post-university. My goal is not just to get you through 4 years of college and get your degree. My goal is to set you up for a successful career. So very early on, I ask my students, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And do you know what the most common answer is?
What's that?
I don't know.
Well, kind of sounds like my career right there.
Well, if you could pick the perfect job or the perfect location, what do you see yourself doing? And a lot of students say, well, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, as a freshman, it's not that big of a deal. Over the course of the next few semesters, you should start to hone in on that. But some of the time, I get students who come in and are freshmen and sophomore, and I say, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And it's a fairly frequent answer I get from them is, I'd like to be a psychological profiler and work for the FBI. I say, wow, that's great. The first thing is, why did you pick criminal justice as your degree? Because really, you should be in psychology.
Right. The name has a clue in it. Psychological.
Yeah. And so I explained to them, hey, here's what you have to do to be qualified for that job. And here's kind of the outlook for the number of psychological profiler jobs that are out there. While it's a super popular TV show, there's not a lot of positions for psychological profilers. So without telling the student, hey, the likelihood that you become a psychological profiler is really low, I ask them questions, provide them with some advice, and say, hey, look into this. And then you come back to me and we'll talk about setting up a plan. If that's transferring you to the psychology department, that's great. If you come back and you decide you want to do something else, that's fine too.
Would you classify that conversation that you had with them right there is kind of giving them a peek behind the curtain?
Oh,
hey, listen, we've got this grand stage up here and you see psychological profiler and you've got this idea of what you think it's like, but the reality may not be what you think it is. So your job then is to give them that peek to make sure that they're on their right path.
That they understand what they're getting themselves into and they understand whatever job they want, what those qualifications are. I look back at my own career. I wanted to be the police. That's all I wanted to be. And when I was successful and I secured that job, really for the next 10 or 12 years after that, I had absolutely no plan. I had a very, very blessed and rewarding career because Lady Luck looked out for me. And now when I talk to these students, I say, hey, man, don't leave it up to chance. If this is what you want to do, Here's how you go about it. And those are some of the most rewarding experiences that I have when somebody in their sophomore or junior year tells me what they want to do or what organization they want to work for. And then sometimes before graduation, but frequently right after graduation, I'll get an email or a phone call that says, hey, I got my dream job. I'm on the launching pad. Thanks for everything you did.
Our guest on the podcast last week, Grayson Story, was attending the Naval Academy. And he went into the Naval Academy believing that he wanted a career in submarines. And he found out he wasn't the engineering type, and that being in an enclosed place like that, maybe not for him. But not everybody can come to that self-discovery. As a leader in secondary education, in higher education, it's helping to point them in the right direction based upon your breadth and depth of knowledge about the academic portion and the practical part of it.
That's really my job in a nutshell. Find out what they want to do. Let them know what the qualifications are. Let them know what the process is and point them in the right direction. After that, it's really up to them to follow through with it.
All right. So then those people coming into the program now, how would you compare them to the people that you came into the profession with, or the people that came into the profession when you were a boss? Because, every generation, get off my lawn, this getting older thing, we complain about the next generation, but how do you compare them to what you saw personally and what you're seeing now on the academic side?
Boy, that's a really interesting question. When I came into the job, I grew up on the west side of the state. And the reason why I landed on the east side of the state was law enforcement jobs were so hard to get. I tested at numerous places before I ever secured a job. It was really, really hard. Today, that's not the case. I tell my students, you tell me where you want to work in the United States, and I'll find you a job within 50 miles of that location. So they have much more opportunities than we do. When I broke in on the job with the people that I worked closely with, our life was about the job. We fought and scratched for every available minute of overtime. We waited for the old guys to retire so we could bump up the seniority level to get some more overtime or get a better shift. And a lot of us paid the price for that. Young adults that are coming into the field now, I think, have a much healthier view of their life. They want to go into this profession because they want to serve their community. But they also understand that the career is not their entire life. They have a much better view of work-life balance. And for somebody from my generation, especially towards the end of my career, it was really, really frustrating for me to post overtime and have it not be filled and have to order people in. And I can remember thinking to myself, what is wrong with these people? Why are they like this? Are they lazy? Are they not connected to the mission? And really what I came to understand was their view is different than my view. And just because their view is different, it doesn't make it wrong. So I stepped back and I said, let's talk to some of these people. Let's find out what's going on. And a lot of those people are like, hey, I'll work 40, 50 hours a week, but after that, that's it. I want to spend time with my family. I want to spend time with my friends. And it's a different perspective. So I think their work ethic overall is very similar to ours. I remember when I broke in on the job, the guys that had 15, 20 years of experience looked at us and said, oh my God, this profession is in so much trouble. I can't believe we're turning it over to these kids. They're a mess. They're this, they're that. As my career progressed, I tried not to be that person. I tried not to look at them and say, here's everything that's wrong with the next generation, in part because I'm responsible for bringing up that generation. So a lot of the problems that we think we have with this next generation is a result of, how we brought those kids up.
One of the things that I admire most about your leadership, especially the leadership at the university, is your belief, and not just stated belief, but you live it, that your role is to prepare people for the profession. It's not about the degree. No. It's not about GPA. And when I first started doing some teaching for you, I remember you telling me, so Mike, in order for the degree to have any value at all, the program must be rigorous, not impossible, but you have to work for it. And so I just want you to kind of touch briefly, if you would, how do you see your role as a leader in academics as it relates to testing? And secondly, because this is a big one, and folks, it doesn't matter if you disagree with this. I happen to agree with Vic on this. Especially in the criminal justice department, the acceptance of late work. Why is it so important that work be delivered properly, completed, and on time?
Okay, when it comes to assessments, and I think some of my students, if any of them are listening to this, they're probably throwing their head back and going, oh my gosh, here we go again. The easiest thing for an instructor to do is to put out a true, false, multiple choice exam.
Why is that the easiest?
Because you don't have to grade it. It's automated. You can throw it in a Scantron, or if you do it online, it's automatically graded. The problem with that is that students understand the answer to it, and the answer goes into short-term memory. So what amendment to the Constitution deals with the freedom of speech? Oh, that's the First Amendment. The right to bear arms, that's the Second Amendment. Miranda, that's 5. That's great that they know what the amendment is. But when you get out into the real world, you not only have to know the amendment, you have to be able to apply it. So explain to me how the Fifth Amendment impacts an interview and an interrogation. So when I test students, I frequently use all essay questions, all short answer questions, or something that I've recently changed and started to do is do oral examinations, where at the end of the semester, I will give the students a list of topics that we covered, usually 6 of them. And I will say, you pick 2 topics that you want to tell me about, and I'm going to randomly pick 2 topics when you show up to question you about. And it's not, what year was the Constitution assigned? It's a situation of, explain to me what postmortem lividity is and why that is important for an investigator to understand. Can they apply what they know? Search and seizure. We all know, the exceptions to the search and seizure. But if I give you a situation and then ask you, can you search the backpack? Do you know what the answer is? It's a 50-50 shot. Can you search the backpack? It's either yes or no. I don't care. That's not the important question. The really important question is the second one. Explain to me why or why not.
So would you agree that when it comes to those areas right there, what is often referred to as working in the gray area, it's only gray because the light of applicable knowledge hasn't been shown on what they're talking about?
I agree 100%. And whether it's students or active duty law enforcement, I tell them, you need to be a master of really at least 3 things. Laws of arrest. When can you arrest somebody? When can't you arrest somebody? What crime you are investigating? That's pretty simple and straightforward. The next one is Miranda. And everybody knows, hey, when you're in custody and asked incriminating questions, you have to be advised of your Miranda rights. but do you understand how that applies? Because in different situations, you may or you may not have to advise them. And what are the pros of advising somebody and what are the pros of not advising somebody? Then you get to search and seizure, which is always changing, always changing. When you truly understand current search and seizure, it is incredibly powerful. You can show up on a scene right away and you're like, absolutely not. We can't search. We got to go get a search warrant. Or you show up and you're like, oh yeah, we can search based upon A, B, and C. So that's incredibly powerful information for students to know. I want to jump back 1 second to cover your question about late work. All right. I'll add something to it. It's not only late work, it's also extra credit. In none of my classes do I accept late work. And in none of my classes do I give extra credit. And for students, especially students that are freshmen and sophomore, they're very frustrated with that because in high school, you get extra credit and you get this thing that's called a test retake. I never heard of that when I was in high school, but apparently if you don't do well enough, you get to, or test corrections. You can do test corrections and bring your score up to 80%. I don't believe in any of that. And the reason why is when you're out there in the field, and I don't care if you're an FBI agent, Customs and Border Protection, state police, municipal police officer, you get one shot at it. When you're out there, you make decisions. If you make the wrong one, there's a penalty associated with that. Whether the statement doesn't come in, the evidence gets thrown out, the case gets dismissed, or God forbid you get disciplined, sued, or fired over it, or criminally charged. There's no such thing as extra credit. Your first effort has to be your best effort. Because if you go out to a scene and you do a mediocre job of investigating that, when you get in the courtroom and you come to the realization that your job was mediocre, you can't call time out. You can't say, hey, judge, time out. I'd like a redo. Can I do some extra credit work to bring my work up to an acceptable level? You get one shot at it. And students start to understand the importance of that when they enroll in these classes. And they're like, I'm only going to get one crack at it. And the worst thing that happens at the university level is you get a bad grade. What happens when you're out there in the field? Hey, we're not worried about bad grades. We're worried about getting hurt, getting sued, getting criminally charged, violating somebody else's rights, sending the wrong person to jail or prison. The stakes are much higher out in the field. So let's learn it when we're in the classroom and make sure we have it right.
Going back to that intimate knowledge that you talked about, obviously it's about understanding what you can do, right? Mm-hmm. But it's at least as important that they get an understanding of what they can't do, not just for their protection, but for the protections of the citizens that we've been sworn to protect, to uphold. It's ensuring that we don't violate their rights. That's what that type of knowledge is. Because when you start operating in the gray area, buddy, and you start driving up on somebody's lawn, bad things are going to be happening.
That's why I say knowledge is power. And I've said this in multiple classrooms before. Tell me when somebody's knowledge actually hurt them. Knowledge is power. When you go out there, you understand what you can do and what you can't do, and you're able to articulate it. No matter where you are in the organization, when you have that knowledge, people will look to you for advice. And that's one of the tracks you can take to become a leader within your organization.
So I know this because we've talked about this. Well, we talk about it just about every semester, to be honest with everybody. How frustrating is it for you in your leadership role, because you're the main person at the criminal justice. So when somebody has a bad problem, you're the person they come to.
Yes.
How frustrating is it for you when a student comes to you at the very end of the semester and says, I don't think I'm going to pass my class, 2 days before they go home?
Yeah.
Why is that so frustrating for you?
Because at that point, I can't help them out. I can tell you that generally starts to happen about week 12 of a 16-week semester. And as we get closer to the final exam, the number of students that approach me with a problem or an issue only increases. And that's where identifying a problem early on is so important. And we have a system at our university that we call the early alert system, that as soon as a student starts to miss assignments or get lower than acceptable grades on an assignment, I get alerted. And I will reach out to that student and have a meeting with them. Some of the time it's, they had a bad day, just didn't test very well, or they didn't understand an assignment. But as soon as you can identify an issue with the student and start to interact with them to put in problem-solving measures, the greater chance you have of being successful and getting it turned around. And in the story I tell virtually every one of these students is, and I stole this from you, it's the doctor's office visit versus the emergency room. If you have a pain in your chest with some, radiating numbness down your left arm and you ignore it, it might be that you just slept on your left shoulder weird, but it also could be the sign of a heart attack. If you continue to ignore these early warning signs, you could end up in the emergency room, which now is a really big deal and your life is at risk. So I tell my students, hey, this is a doctor's office visit. I want to make sure that everything is fine. And if it's just a bump in the road, that's fine. This is just an easy checkup. We're going to continue to monitor you to make sure you're okay. But I don't want to end up in the trauma unit. And unfortunately, for some students, they ignore things until all of a sudden they have trouble breathing and they pass out and we end up in the emergency room. And there's not much I can do there.
Because I know that I've dealt with this and I'm pretty sure you have too. When we wait and it becomes emergent.
Yeah.
Okay. That's oftentimes when these young adults will get their parents involved. Oh. They haven't want their parents to be involved in the decision making the entire semester, but now the parent comes, why aren't you letting my kid do this? And they have a totally wrong perception about what has gone wrong. I would tell them, so listen, I've told them from the beginning that as their leader in this class, my goal is their success, but they have to allow me to help them, to let me help you.
Yes.
Help me to help you. It gets to the point where I can't help you anymore.
Yeah, there is a certain point of no return. And I tell my students at the beginning of the semester, there's no reason why you shouldn't get an A in my class. There's really not. If you put forth the effort, the good grades will come. And every semester, I have to fail students. And I don't think I've ever failed a student because the student just could not grasp the material. The number one reason why students fail is they don't put in the effort to read the material, to be prepared for class, to take notes, to understand the assignment, to put in a good faith effort to turn in a quality assignment or do a quality assessment. It comes down to effort most of the time. And if you don't put that effort in early on, the longer it goes, the more work it's going to be and the more difficult it's going to be to turn around a ship. It's the same thing with new officers that come into the profession. That first year is pretty foggy and they're overwhelmed with things and they're on probation and everything's new and cool. And then after that, they get comfortable. Well, it's at that point that I always tried to impress upon them, this is the point where you need to work ahead. Stay up to speed. Don't fall a year and a half behind on legal updates. Stay up on your skills, whether it's defensive tactics, EVO, policy knowledge, those kind of things, because it will be so much easier for you to maintain. Once you ignore that and you start to fall behind, it becomes very, very difficult to turn that ship around.
Now, I know that one of the things that you teach for command presence is the new FTO model that we recently came out with, the CTE model, where we say you coach, train, and then evaluate.
Yes.
And so I want to ask you from a leadership perspective, when you were still on the job, how frustrating was it for you as the leader that your FTOs or your FTO coordinator didn't come to you with an officer that was struggling with the program until it was virtually beyond bringing that person back? How frustrating was that for you?
It's super frustrating. It's like the student who waits till week 12. I can't help you out now. No problem gets better with time. Doctor's office, emergency room. You got a temperature, you're vomiting, come on in. It may just be a cold, a virus. It'll be over in 2 days. We can, figure it out. But when that's ignored and then the symptoms get worse and worse, now it makes it difficult for us to turn people around. There are several officers who, without the assistance of their FTOs and their supervisors and some of their fellow officers, would have been fired in the FTO period and would have never had a career in law enforcement. But because early on we were able to identify some shortcomings in their knowledge and skills and get them some additional help, they've went on to have wonderful, super successful careers. Early intervention is the key. And in this new FTO model through command presence is really a paradigm shift. I think most other FTO models are based upon, here's how you grade them, here's all the liability that goes along with it, and here's what happens when they don't make the grade, you get rid of them. Our program is completely different because we spend days talking about how to teach people, how to instruct people, and how to impart knowledge to them. And that's a huge challenge. A lot of times we have people who are extremely experienced, who have a ton of knowledge, and we automatically think that they'd be a great FTO or they'd be a great adjunct professor. And we put them in those positions and think they have all this knowledge, they'll just impart it, but they don't know how to teach. They don't know how to instruct. So they're not able to transfer that knowledge. And they become frustrated when the student continues to underperform. They say, I just don't understand why so-and-so can't get it. Well, some of that may be in the way that the information is being imparted to the student or the recruit. And I've found that not only in my professional life as a law enforcement officer, but also as an instructor in the classroom. Most people teach the way they like to learn. If you have a classroom of people like you, that's great.
Yeah, exactly.
But we don't have a classroom of people like us. So we have to change those things so that the person who's receiving the information receives it in the most efficient and effective manner for them.
Well, as we're wrapping things up, I think it's important to point out that in both situations, and it doesn't matter if you're in law enforcement or what profession you're in, and in the academic world, I want you to succeed. Yeah. I've invested a lot of money into getting you to this point where you're now in our training program. And then on the academic side, so listen, I recognize that you've invested a lot of money to be here. Maybe your parents have invested a lot of money to be here. But in both cases, I have to ensure As the leader, I have to ensure that this person is properly prepared for the next level, wherever it is that they're going from here. And that's a tremendous responsibility, but it's also incredibly gratifying when it's done successfully.
That's the absolute best part of my job. You know, in my previous career or in my current position, I look back at people that I've worked with, students that I've had in my classroom, and when they are successful, it is so gratifying to me knowing that I played some small role in that. That's why I do it. That's why I love what I do. It's not about me. It's actually about them.
That force multiplier, that legacy that we often talk about, it's so gratifying. But I want to give you what my key takeaways were today, because I always want to give our guests the opportunity to correct me and say, Mike, no, you chucklehead, that's not what I said at all. Number one, staying relevant, staying up on what's going on in your profession, no matter what the profession, is best accomplished by being full of questions instead of being full of answers.
Yep.
Leadership, one of the primary jobs, responsibilities, is to ensure that they are providing the tools and the training to the people that they've been entrusted with so that they can do the job that's expected of them.
I think that's accurate. I'd like to put a little caveat on that. So it's not only the tools and the training or information, but within whatever financial constraints you have. You know, different organizations have different financial situations. And we travel around the country, we teach cops, and, you know, we're professional complainers. So we always want the latest, greatest widget and all that. And some places just can't provide that. But as a leader, it is your job to provide the best available tools and teaching within your funding level that you can for your people.
And I think you and I agree that one of the greatest leadership tools is the use of stories. They're great, but in the words of Steve Martin in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, here's an idea. When you tell a story, have a point. It has to be relevant, doesn't it?
Exactly, it does.
One of the things you said, we didn't use this terminology, but being able to share the mistakes that you've made is really about the leader seeing into that person's future and recognizing that if I made the mistake, that there's at least the possibility they could, and you're giving them the warning signs ahead of time.
Yeah. You know, Mike, you and I worked closely together for a long time, and you know 1,000 of my mistakes, and I appreciate you not revealing them during this podcast.
Roll the window down.
But you know my mistakes. All right. When you're in a leadership role, all right, or a position of authority, those people, they don't understand your mistakes. They weren't there to witness them. A lot of times you're 10, 15, maybe 20 years between you, and they look at you and they go, oh my gosh, this is the department chair, and he did this and that. He must have been, you know, near perfect. Or, you know, you're the assistant chief or whatever. Oh my God, they don't understand your mistakes. When you share with them, here's what I did, here's the mistakes that I made, they see you more as a person. And they will be, if you expose your vulnerabilities, other people are much more likely to expose theirs, and you'll develop a much stronger relationship.
And that's what influence is all about, right?
That's it.
Rewarding careers are best accomplished through intention.
Yes.
There are people that get some rewarding careers on accident, but those are few and far between. Would you agree?
You got to have a plan. What's your plan? You know, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
I think it's important for us to remember, folks, that in order for something to truly have value, it needs to be achieved through some type of rigor. You know, very rarely does something that comes easy to us really provide any lasting value.
Yeah, unless you win the lottery.
Yeah, I'm all about that. If anybody's willing to share.
Well, I think that's really true. the harder you work at something, once you become successful at it, the more rewarding that it is.
Finally, I'm trying to figure out how to put this here, whether you're on the receiving end or you're on the leadership side of things, that applicable knowledge should be the goal. Knowing something isn't enough. The knowing how and when and how best to apply it should be the ultimate goal of someone going to try to learn something new, and for those who are trying to provide the leadership to show them how to do it.
The true experts have that knowledge, know how and when to apply it. We all know people that are incredibly intelligent. They know many more facts than probably you and I together. But the problem with their facts are, in the real world, they can't apply it. And that's what makes true experts, the knowledge and being able to apply it to various situations.
And folks, no matter what career you're in, we should be aspiring to be an expert in our chosen profession, because it not only makes us better, it makes our organization better. At some point, it's going to make society better. If we were a society of true experts, not keyboard experts, but true experts, we would be much better off and much farther along. But Vic, we'll make sure that we include in our show notes links to Madonna University and the criminal justice department there. It's a fine program. I can't thank you enough for being here today and sharing your experience, because I think it really is unique from the academic and the practical side. I think it's invaluable.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you.
And for our listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed the episode, and I certainly hope you did, if you didn't, please let me know why. Please be sure to follow the podcast on your favorite podcast provider. You can also find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website at commandpresence.net/podcast. Also, be sure to check us out on LinkedIn, follow us there. And as you go through this next week, folks, and it should be every week, remember, be the leader you wish you had.